Today we're all going to talk about the sonnet form of poetry. There are many forms of poetry out there like haiku, villanelle, sestina, ballad, but the sonnet is, to me, the crown of all the different forms of poetry. So we're going to first talk about the history and how it developed and where it came from, what is a sonnet, and then we're going to look at the two most popular forms of sonnets. There's actually lots of different kinds of sonnets out there, but we're going to focus on the Petrarchan form and the Shakespearean form. So let's start with a little bit of information about what the sonnet is. First thing I would have you know is that just like the haiku is a Japanese form of poetry, like it came from a certain nationality, so did the sonnet. The sonnet is an Italian form of poetry, and it was basically invented by a guy named Francesco Petrarch. And sometimes pronounced Petrarch. And he wrote all his sonnets. They were all love sonnets for a girl that he called Laura. He wrote over 300 of them. And although I don't think he's the actual, like he invented it, but he made it so famous that he became the one that we all associate with the sonnet. The word sonnet comes from an Italian word, obviously, since it's an Italian form of poetry, sonetto, which just means little song. And indeed, one of my metaphors for a sonnet would be a pop song. You're going to see that a lot of the romantic sonnets we read at the beginning of this unit basically sound like they're saying the exact same things we hear on the radio today. The third thing I'd have you know is that sonnets are always associated with love poetry. This won't be true as we move through the sonnet unit. We begin with romantic love. We move to divine love, we get a little political, we talk about war, and then we're suddenly in the modern era where people could write sonnets about anything. But they all begin with romantic love. Typically a man longing for the love of a woman who often is not requiting it or reciprocating it or returning it. That's why we also get the idea of the Petrarchan mistress, because Laura was never reciprocating Petrarch's love, and it inspired him to write another sonnet, and he would just write another one, and he just wouldn't give up, I suppose. The fourth thing I'd have you know about sonnets is that when you put them together, a lot of times, like when you read all 300 of Petrarch's love sonnets, you get sort of a sonnet cycle, a sort of story. These are not narrative poems, but they kind of tell a love story, just the way pop songs are not often narratives, but they often are situations where, like, my girlfriend cheated on me and I'm really mad, or something like that. It's kind of a story, but kind of not a story. It's more like a situation, if anything else. Although we associate the sonnet with Petrarch and later Shakespeare, there are other famous Italian Petrarch writers of sonnets, and they are Dante. He wrote sonnets in his Vita Nuova for Beatrice, or Beatrice, and Michelangelo wrote sonnets as well. Not just a painter, not just a sculptor, but also a poet, so beyond even the genius that you imagined. So that's sort of the history of the sonnet. Let's talk about what makes a sonnet, and we'll start with the Italian tradition, since that's where it began, and then we'll move over to the English tradition and talk about how they're slightly different. So let's talk about the Petrarchan sonnet, invented by Petrarch. They have complicated rules. They're sort of simple and complex at the same time, and that's probably why the sonnet has survived, is that it never is boring. It's just complicated enough that it can keep people doing interesting things with it. But one thing that's true of all sonnets is that all sonnets have 14 lines. The other thing that is true of sonnets is that all sonnets are written in iambic pentameter. This is, of course, the meter that we associate primarily with Shakespeare, but many, many people wrote it. It is the most common formal meter in English literature. Basically, we could get into the details of it, but it's 10 syllables of alternating stress. So there's 5 that are stressed and 5 that are unstressed. And that might be the most difficult thing to keep up with a sonnet, is to make sure that you're writing it in meter. The third rule of a sonnet is that it has a rhyme scheme. So it not only has like rhythm rules, it has rhyme rules, and it has line rules. So everything is kind of governed in a sonnet, and it's sort of a very controlled type of little song, since it's only 14 lines. But the Petrarchan rhyme scheme is the following. It's A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A, C-D, 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 or sometimes it can go C-D-E, C-D-E. There isn't really a fixed portion of that. But notice that it has 4 A rhymes and 4 B rhymes, and they're all sort of bound together into that ABBA. You got to have, you know, words that rhyme 4 times and still make sense is kind of what you have to do. The rhyme scheme creates a structure for the sonnet that it usually divides the poem into 2 parts. The first 8 lines, the ABBA, is called an octave, as if from music. And the second part, the CD, 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 is what we call a sestet, 6 lines. And usually something happens between the 8 lines and the 6 lines, and that is what we call the volta. A volta is an Italian term as well. And a volta is a dancing term, actually, and it means turning. It's what we might more commonly call a shift in the poem, where the poem might go downward for 8 lines, and there's suddenly a but or a yet or a so, and it goes upward for the next 6 lines. And it sort of makes a little bit of energy to the sonnet so that it moves around a little bit more. The last thing I'd have you know about a Petrarchan sonnet is that they are very difficult to write in English because of the number of rhymes. It's hard to rhyme that many times and not kind of sound Dr. Seussish or sound foolish or, you know, kind of ridiculous in some ways. So when we see a sonnet in English that is written in Petrarchan rhyme scheme, we're kind of double impressed because they somehow got away with all those rhymes and didn't sound ridiculous when they did it. Now, I can't show you a sonnet by Petrarch because they're in Italian, and the moment you take them out of the Italian and put them into a translated English, they lose the rhyme and they lose the meter. They might keep the images, but suddenly, like, the poem's connection between sound and sense is gone. And that is why Robert Frost said that, you know, poetry is what gets lost in translation. So I can't show you a Petrarchan sonnet, but I can show you a famous sonnet, a piece of Americana, if you will. And it is Emma Lazarus' poem. She was, I believe, 18 when she wrote it. And it's a sonnet that you could find at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. Now, I want you to notice some things about this sonnet to kind of get into the Petrarchan mood. One is that we see that it's divided into an octave and a sestet. And she put a space between them to sort of indicate that there's a big shift or a big turn there. Now, the title of the poem is The New Colossus. She is referring to the Statue of Liberty in New York City as a colossus. And that has sort of an allusion to Echoes of Rome, which we'll talk about in a minute. But let's go back to the structure. It's 8 lines and 6 lines. And then I want you to look at the rhyme scheme. You know, ABBA, ABBA. Fame, land, stand, flame. Name, hand, command, frame. And when we see that she put these into a sentence that makes sense, it's kind of impressive all those words have a purpose. Down here we have a CD, CD, CD. She poor, free shore, me door. Now, what's the difference between the octave and the sestet? Well, you know, before we read the poem, I can just tell you that the octave describes the Statue of Liberty by contrasting it with another famous statue from history, and then the Statue of Liberty actually speaks in the second part of the poem. So it's from description to speaking, and when we look at any sonnet, we're always kind of attuned to where is the turn of the poem happening and what is the nature of the turn. Now, to understand this poem, we do have to understand an allusion. She is alluding to one of the 7 great wonders of the world, if you've ever heard of that, from the ancient world. There's the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, there's the Pyramids of Egypt, and there is the Colossus at Rhodes, which does not exist anymore, but was a giant statue of Zeus holding a lightning bolt with 2 legs over the harbor where the boats had to go through Zeus's legs, this sort of oppressive tyrant kind of god, kind of scary. And she's contrasting what the Statue of Liberty is like compared to the Colossus of Rhodes. And she begins by the very strong word not. She says that the Statue of Liberty is not like the Colossus of Rhodes, although she is kind of a wonder of the modern world. And so let's read this little piece of Americana, and you can hear the little song that's at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. She won a contest to have her poem put there. And it is a wonderful piece of America. The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. It's an amazing piece of Americana because it's about when America was welcoming to immigrants and wanted the wretched refuse of Europe's teeming shore. I love the description of the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. She's welcoming. She lifts her lamp beside the golden door of opportunity. When we look back at the poem and we see those rhymes, if I'd given you this list of words and just said write a poem using them, no telling what would have come out. Nothing so sort of dignified and sort of put together. You would have felt like you had to force these words into certain meanings. And a great poet never forces a word. The word seems natural and right every single time. So that's a good example of a Petrarchan sonnet, you know, a nice octave, a nice sestet, all these rhymes sort of collected together. But as I mentioned, Petrarchan sonnets are a little bit harder to write in English than Shakespearean sonnets. The sonnet traveled from Italy over to England, and Shakespeare sort of messed with it a little bit, and some would say improved the sonnet, but mostly he just made it a different shape and a different, capable of doing different things. So let's take a look at what Shakespeare did with the sonnet. Basically, Shakespeare just, you know, messed with that little box of words, that, you know, those 14 lines, in a different kind of way. He kept some rules the same. Shakespearean sonnets have 14 lines. Shakespearean sonnets are written in iambic pentameter. What Shakespeare did that was sort of genius is he changed the rhyme scheme. We could say he made it a little easier to write, but I think he made it more supple. Petrarchan sonnets are divided into two. Shakespearean sonnets are divided into 3 and a couplet, or 4 parts. You could just do a lot more with a Shakespearean sonnet. Generally, his rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. It's this rhyming couplet that kind of is typical of Shakespeare. He liked to end scenes with rhyming couplets, so if a character, you know, they didn't have lights or a curtain to come down on the globe, so if a character wanted to indicate that he was going to leave the stage, he might pronounce a rhyming couplet. It's kind of like the end of a symphony with a bump bump, and everybody knows that the scene is over and it's time to clap. So Shakespeare says, Hamlet says, "The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right." And he sort of walks off, and everybody knows that the scene is over. Shakespeare, you know, kind of could not be dramatic. So he's dramatic even in his lyrical poems of the sonnets. Basically, we can see that when he wrote, he divided the poem differently than the Petrarchan sonnets. He divided it into 3 quatrains. We learn a lot of terms of poetry when we study the sonnet. And 1 couplet. So he can do more than just 2 things. He can do 3 things and then do something at the end for the most part. The quatrains usually present 3 questions or 3 images sometimes. They can do a lot of different things. And then they sort of sum up or answer in the couplet. The couplet sort of carries things off. Sometimes the volta in a Shakespeare sonnet occurs at the couplet. So we get all the way through the poem, through 12 lines, we've only got 2 left, and Shakespeare will shift the poem at the end. As I said, very dramatic. And it works pretty much every time. And I would say that it is easier to write than a Petrarchan sonnet. Just because of the rhymes there. If you need to write a sonnet, you know, I would choose to write a Shakespearean sonnet just because you're going to have more rhymes. If you remember, the Petrarchan sonnet ended with either D or E, but in Shakespeare you go to F's and G's, and so you get a lot more rhymes in, and it's a lot easier to rhyme. Let's look at a Shakespearean sonnet. These don't kind of wow you on their first read, but the more you study them, the more they reward. This one is, I divided it up a little bit. Usually it's just 14 lines without these divisions, but I wanted you to see that we have 1 quatrain, a 2nd quatrain, a 3rd quatrain, and then a couplet at the end. And let's look at the rhyme scheme here. Remember, it's A-B, A-B. Hold, hang, cold, sang. Day, west, away, rest. Fire, lie, expire by, strong, long. You hear that strong, long at the end, and that's that nice rhyming couplet there. We can see that it's kind of more musical than the Petrarchan. It's more lovely to the ear, and that is true of all Shakespeare's sonnets, as they are surpassingly lovely. Now, this sonnet presents three images. They kind of are decreasing in their sort of evoking of pathos. They get sadder and smaller as they go. And maybe the easiest way to sum up this sonnet is to say it's the voice of possibly an older man, and he is describing getting old, and he kind of turns it at the end, as sonnets do, to speak to his beloved and tell her how his age is a factor in the way that they feel about each other. So the first image is a season. The second image is a time of day, so we move from seasons to day. And the third image is like a little fire. And all of them have in common that they represent old age and sort of getting past your prime. Let's read it. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, do hang upon those limbs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day, as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire, that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well, which thou must leave ere long. So we can see, it doesn't impress you at first. I know it takes a while to start loving sonnets, but we have detailed images of, I'm in the autumn of my life. I'm at the evening of my life. I'm like a little fire that's just about to go out. And since I don't have much time left on this earth, you perceive this, and it makes your love stronger, because you know that I won't be here long and our love won't last as long. There's always this threat of time destroying love in these poems. So we're going to look at Shakespearean sonnets primarily in this unit at the beginning of the weeks. And then we're going to move into modern sonnets, and we're going to see that modern sonnets start doing Petrarchan things and Shakespearean things. And well, the first question we ask of a modern sonnet is it Shakespearean or is it Petrarchan, or is it a hybrid? So to sum up, I just want you to remember a few things, is that the basic difference between a Petrarchan sonnet and a Shakespeare sonnet is 1, rhyme scheme, and 2, its division of meaning. And these are related in that the rhyme scheme is what's creating the division of meaning for the most part. And I would also have you remember that no one follows all the rules, even Shakespeare. He will break them here and there for dramatic effect, or maybe we could say his poetry fails him a little bit there. And I want you to know, as we get into modern sonnets, that modern sonnets are hybrids. They might be Petrarchan in rhyme scheme, but Shakespearean in structure. You never really know what you're going to get. We have to meet a sonnet on its own terms, but we'll start with Shakespearean sonnets, and we won't have to ask the question, is it Petrarchan, is it Shakespearean? Because we'll know it was written by Shakespeare. It's Shakespearean.